History as it happens, November 9th, 2021. The conscience of an anti-Trump conservative.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seems more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication.
The single biggest issue, the issue that gets the most pull, the most respect, the biggest cheers, is talking about the election fraud of 2020 presidential election.
Donald Trump is still the most influential Republican politician in the country, and his style of politics doesn't appear to be going away. But some conservatives believe the election results in Virginia show the way past Trumpism to a future with Republicans back in control of the White House. But what kind of conservatism would that be? That's next as we speak to Barbara Comstock as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Virginia kids are falling behind, so we've watched critical race theory come into our schools and try to divide our children based on seeing everything through a lens as opposed to the content of their character.
The number one issue from the polls was the economy. And so the sinking economy and all that, which he was addressing from the start, was an issue. And I think if you go back and you look at his ads, he was addressing the education issue largely.
It is amazing how quickly things can change in politics. Think back to January in the aftermath of the Capitol riot, Biden's inauguration, the Georgia Senate races, the vaccine rollout. Democrats were the ones celebrating what they hoped would be a banner year as the country recovered from the pandemic.
We'll press forward with speed and urgency, for we have much to do in this winter of peril and significant possibilities. Much to repair, much to restore, much to heal, much to build, and much to gain.
Well, fast forward to today, early November. Biden's approval rating is way down, and Republicans have won the governor's race in Virginia, a state Biden won by 10 points. Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe, and Republicans did well in other unexpected places, fueling optimism they'll cream Democrats in next year's midterms. And the reason why conservatives are so pleased with Glenn Youngkin, well, here's Rich Lowry writing in the National Review. Youngkin realized his coalition had to consist of voters firmly attached to Donald Trump and those turned off by him. He welded them together by avoiding criticisms of Trump while maintaining an arm's length from him personally, taking care to brand himself as a relatable and inoffensive suburban dad, and, importantly, emphasizing the cultural issues around education that resonated with and motivated both pools of voters. Again, that is Rich Lowry in the National Review. Maybe another way of saying it is Trump-like policies without the Trump personality. Now, no one believes Trump is out of the picture yet. The former president recently held another one of his rallies in Iowa, where he held forth for about 2 hours, talking about the subject he just can't let go.
We did far better in 2020 than we did in 2016. It was a rigged election,
So if the economy and education were the deciding issues in Virginia, national polls continue to show that a majority of Republican voters across the country believe the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Trump himself has promised to work against Republican candidates who don't subscribe to his election conspiracies or election fantasies, and that is putting the party in a weird spot heading into 2022. GOP leaders clearly want to talk about the future rather than a lost election, but they're also afraid of risking Trump's wrath if they criticize him directly. Clearly, they would rather criticize Democrats about issues that have been at the heart of modern conservatism: federal spending, taxes, cultural elitism, in the form of critical race theory and the moral panic sweeping over elite institutions, among others. It may not be the party of Reagan any longer, but Republicans believe Democrats are out of touch with ordinary Americans. Barbara Comstock was elected 3 times to the Virginia House of Delegates and then elected twice to the U.S. House, succeeding Republican Frank Wolf, who had held the seat in the 10th District for 24 years. She lost in the 2018 midterms in the blue wave that carried the Democrats back into the House majority. She now works in government consulting at the firm Baker Donelson. Barbara Comstock, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you.
So before we get to the serious stuff, I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about the fact that you're probably receiving more national media interviews now than when you were in office?
Oh, well, some of the things I'm focusing on are how do we fix the Republican Party here post-Trump? And I think in Virginia, as has been observed already a lot of places, my friend Glenn Youngkin has provided a good but unique model. You know, it's exciting to see your friends succeed. I also had a former staffer win a Percival City Council race on Tuesday night, too. So it's actually fun to watch.
Yes, we'll get into the Youngkin victory in a bit. Half joking here. Do you have more liberal friends now than you used to as an anti-Trump conservative?
Well, my anti-Trump is that he is anti-Constitution. He's anti-law, you know, the sore loser, the impeachment, all of those things are why I oppose Trump. I am still a Republican, despite my frustrations, you know, like Adam Kinzinger or Liz Cheney. So then they're reminded, oh, wait, you're still a conservative. And then you get the same attacks that you always got. So I've always had bipartisan friendships since, you know, I was a kid. I grew up in Massachusetts. So I live in a diverse area. If you didn't have friends who have a lot of differing views, you wouldn't have many friends. So, and I think that's an advantage in life to have friends who are different.
Well, of course, a society needs to have that. Have you lost any pro-Trump Republican friends or?
No, not really any true friends. There's some of them we just agree to disagree.
Because you are vocal. You're vocal. You're on TV. You're on CNN quite often. You know, when I worked as a local reporter for years here in D.C., I would interview you fairly often, but we never really had a chance to talk about your political pedigree, so to speak. For those who are not familiar with your politics, who are listening to this podcast anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, you were an aide to Frank Wolf, a long-time Republican congressman in your district, the 10th District in Northern Virginia. What were some of your influences that led you to become a conservative Republican? Was it the Reagan Revolution, something else?
I actually came to Washington with an American University program and interned for Ted Kennedy because my family was from Massachusetts. But being on the Hill, in that experience, I realized I sort of agreed more. And I had a roommate who read National Review, and I started reading that. So ironically, you know, later on, National Review, Washington editor Cato Byrne was a dear, wonderful friend. And I did get to talk to Ted Kennedy, you know, later in life about how ironic here this was. But I always felt it was important to have those relationships on both sides. But Frank Wolf, when I came to Washington to go to law school, was my congressman, and I got to know him. And I think he was a very independent but conservative Republican. And he was a great person to work with and for and advocate for. And then after working for him, I actually was on the Government Reform Committee with Congressman Bill Klinger, who was a very independent Republican. We have a service for him on Saturday with former staff and former members. And so he was just such an incredibly lovely man and person and great congressman. And I always was reminded of the independence of both of those people who I worked for and worked on campaigns for people like Mitt Romney, who's at the Justice Department. So, you know, I think I've got to know a lot of different people in the legal community, Federalist Society. Ted Olson and his late wife, Barbara, were dear friends. Ted still is a great friend. And so I've been privileged to know, you know, leaders in the legal community and the legislative community, you know, and on a bipartisan basis, and have friendships that cross over all those lines. And Debbie Dingell and I were great friends. And since my races were competitive, she'd get attacked just for being my friend, you know, and she's one of those bipartisan people that actually gets things done. You're trying to get things done when you're in Congress. So oftentimes the people you see on TV then are the ones who aren't getting a lot done in Congress.
Theoretically, I think our politics have become more zero-sum, even in the just past couple years since you haven't been on Capitol Hill. So I think we've established what your politics are, Barbara. So let's move on. Why did Glenn Youngkin win?
Well, I think, first of all, he is a great candidate. He is what you see. I mean, I've known him, in the community, and he was a supporter of mine. So I knew him in that capacity, but a supporter of other Republicans like Mitt Romney. Paul Ryan is a friend of his. And the thing that I think is remarkable and why he won was he did better with base voters than Donald Trump did, notably better with women who were in the base. So I think many of them left Trump because of not so much of the politics, but his toxic and unpleasant personality. And I think what you see with Glenn is, somebody who's sunny and optimistic. And certainly when I became a Republican, Ronald Reagan, who, he wanted to include everyone. One of the things that Glenn always said is, I want never Trumpers and I want always Trumpers. I want everyone under the tent. And he ran as his own brand, and he focused on the kitchen table issues. I mean, I know it's trite, but economy was the number one issue. That's what he was focused on. Education, which was, I think, much bigger issue than just the critical race theory thing that's been focused on. It was kids being home for a year and a half in Fairfax County in public schools. And I think it was a broad education issue. It was, it was parents at Thomas Jefferson High School here in Virginia, the number one high school in the country. It's actually a majority minority school. It's a very strong Asian American population and has always been there. My kids never could have gotten in there, but they were now going to change that from a merit system to doing, whatever else they were going to do. You had this idea of dumbing down of math standards. So I think you saw parents just frustrated with education. And when Terry McAuliffe made that statement that parents shouldn't be telling teachers what to do.
The parents had the right to veto books, Glenn, not to be knowledgeable about it, also take them off the shelves. And I'm not going to let parents come into schools and actually take books out and make their own decision.
You vetoed it.
So, yeah, I stopped the bill that I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. I get really tired of everybody running down.
If my husband as a principal had ever said that, he would have been ridden out on a rail because you have very active parents, particularly in Northern Virginia. And he doubled down on it. And I think it tied up all those education issues and the frustrations with a bow. And I think Glenn, who is Doug Wilder, former governor Doug Wilder, pointed out, a Democrat, he said, Glenn Youngkin's going to increase spending on historically Black colleges. He's going to raise teacher salaries. Those were issues he ran on. So he had an education platform from the start that he wanted to run on. And Terry McAuliffe handed that to him. And then thirdly, I think the public safety issue over the past year with the defund the police. You're hearing James Carville, I'll say, these policies were ridiculous. Yes. And he's right. I don't even have to.
Defund the police seems to be popular among white liberals, not African-American Democratic voters.
And not people living in cities that saw their crime rates go up. And he just did better in every area. And of course, suburban voters, even in areas that he didn't win, he won the suburban vote. But even in areas where he didn't win, he dramatically improved over Donald Trump and over other Republicans. Ken Cuccinelli couldn't have pulled off this win. It was unique to him, and I credit it to him as an anti-Trump Republican. I supported him because I knew he was going to being inclusive again, trying to stop the infighting. And really, I think it's now already turned the page. And I think you're going to see people like Chris Sununu maybe run for Senate, Doug Ducey maybe reconsider out in Arizona. And then I think you're just going to have great new faces like Mayor Suarez down in Miami, who won his reelection as an anti-Trump Republican, actually. So I think we are going to see a new generation of leaders, and that's exciting.
You raised a number of points there, so let's try to go at them one at a time. The notion that we might be entering a post-Trump GOP. I'm not sure yet. We're certainly not in a post-Hoover GOP, meaning that after 1932 and FDR's landslide win, the Republican Party and Herbert Hoover totally discredited, right? Donald Trump is still the most influential. He's still the most influential Republican politician in the country, although maybe his influence is waning, as you suggest.
I certainly hope, and what I am working on currently, and why, as you mentioned, you see me on TV often, is I want to support my friends like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, Lisa Murkowski, and people who are being targeted by this mindless cultism and not allowing people to be their own man or their own woman.
Well, it worked with Kinzinger because he's not going to run for re-election.
Actually, he may run for Senate or governor, but his seat was basically eliminated by Democrats. So he didn't have a choice there. You've not heard the last from Adam Kinzinger. He's going to do a great job on this January 6th committee that I think is going to have a lot of important information. And having, from my history, I was chief counsel back in the 90s with the Clinton investigations. And while we got attacked for doing them also, I think getting that information and that truth out is important. And I think it will have an impact on Trump and his future prospects, because people will realize we can have Trump policies without the toxic personality, with all the negatives, and the fact that the twice impeached sore loser guy lost, and let's latch ourselves to people who can prove now in this new environment that they can win.
That's interesting because many people not only have a problem with his personality, they also have an issue with the policies. So back to Youngkin. From my perspective, maybe I'm reading the wrong newspapers and magazines, it seemed that the race in Virginia largely turned on this grievance issue of critical race theory. You said it was about the economy and education and not just CRT, and whether critical race theory is being taught in public schools. But it did seem to turn on that issue, which is a form of grievance politics, which is the Trump brand. Do you agree?
Well, no, I don't agree with the premise, because the number one issue from the polls was the economy. And so the sinking economy and all that, which he was addressing from the start, was an issue. And I think if you go back and you look at his ads, he was addressing the education issue largely. He came out with the historically Black colleges funding early on. He came out with raising teacher pay early on. And then you had the concerns in Loudoun County, of course, with the rape in the school and that being so poorly handled. I think that and Terry McAuliffe's statement brought all those issues together. And while the critical race theory, which we need to have a more serious discussion among people, and I think actually Kristen Soltis Anderson has done some very good polling on that, talking about where people, because I think people are more together on how they want to address the history of slavery and all the issues there that I know my kids didn't learn enough in school, that I certainly didn't. And I know every year schools are expanding and rightfully doing that. My husband is in a private school, and when all of the Black Lives Matters things came up, they had parents and alumni come to them and say, we need to address this more in school. And unlike Terry McAuliffe, they said, hey, we're going to listen to you, and we want you to be part of this discussion and tell us how we can improve. But it's a specific doctrine that there was some people being paid in Loudoun County to talk to teachers about it and all. This is a very diverse area, and we celebrate our diversity. And I think you can bring people together on the issue of having more education on our history without bringing in things that are genuine political conflicts. The systemic racism and the kind of everything is racist and dividing kids into groups, that part people didn't like. So why not focus on what people and parents agree on, find models there where we are teaching the kids much more on this. And I've seen that in the historical associations throughout Virginia, whether it's Mount Vernon or Monticello. It's been a very painful process.
I visit Monticello every September.
Yes, and you think of how kids should know about how much Monticello resisted having that true history that we now all know. That should be part of the history. But you don't have to, as James Carville said, taking Abraham Lincoln's name off of schools or attacking things.
Far.
That's the kind of thing where people think, what are you doing? And now, you have very knee-jerk people saying, oh, this was racist. And I don't think you can call half of a state, the Virginia, who elected the first African-American governor, who voted for Barack Obama twice with pretty good margins. I know in this state, in this ticket, just elected the first African-American woman. And by the way, Terry McAuliffe, he's the one who ran and said, hey, you need to have me instead of the two African-American woman Democrats who were running. Being a friend of Jennifer McClellan, I think she might have been a better candidate. So I think that's what frustrates people too, when if they raise questions, then they are accused of things. Whereas I think the way sort of my husband's school dealt with it, it's like, let's have these discussions. Let's have them civil. I don't like what has happened in school boards and the screaming and yelling and the Trumpy crazy people coming in and being ugly.
Intimidation and threatening.
And that stuff is ugly. But when you have parents who have legitimate concerns and they are told, no, you can't be involved, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So I think having more transparency in the schools, welcoming the engagement of parents, and being a lot more thoughtful on it than has currently been done. And the fact is, in this area, the schools are all run by pretty much entirely Democratic school boards. And I think it would be maybe a little better if you had a little bipartisanship on that and you had people talking to each other instead of past each other, because I think there's a lot more agreement on the need for seriously addressing racism in our country today, the history of it, and how we got here.
But there does seem to be a gray area. For instance, if you teach high schoolers about Jim Crow or redlining, well, that's systemic racism and might be interpreted as CRT. And I think
I certainly wouldn't think that that's what it is. And I always think when you teach history with original documents, and instead of putting labels on things, you just show people what it is. Like if you go down to Selma, you see what it is. You walk through those museums and you see the headlines and you see the video and you see all of that. And that's what would be wonderful for kids to have more of that, just straight on. This is what happened. Listen, women's history has been, ignored over time too. And Virginia only recently put up women's statues and did things there. So we have a long way to go on all these fronts. I think there's a big, broad center that actually agrees on doing more in these areas.
So how does Barbara Comstock define Trumpism?
Well, certainly the toxic politics and the way he talked about race, the way he talked about women was very divisive. And I think the opposite of what Glenn Youngkin and what many Republicans that I've worked with over the years have tried to do. So it's all divisiveness. Trump was the personification of all sort of the worst things that Democrats thought. I think when he won, he kind of felt that was part of why he won, was the sexism, his snarliness and ugliness. And I think he was wrong. I think he won because Hillary was a particularly bad candidate, just like I think Biden won because he wasn't Trump. There's not a center to it, except it's about him. It's ego about him, which is why people call it a cult. He doesn't have a philosophical core, except, if people say nice things about him and then say, and be on this side of an issue, then he will go to it. So you never know where he's going to go on issues. And then he's anti-democratic. He's authoritarian. He had no patience for the democratic process. So I think it's a mindset, and he's just all about himself. He doesn't care if Republicans win, evidenced by Georgia. He's now on a revenge tour over the people who rightfully voted for impeachment and then fortunately rightfully set up this January 6th committee that I think will bring more and more of that to light. Things like the John Eastman legal memo, where they were clearly trying to overturn an election in the most unlawful and unconstitutional ways that you could. And what happened to Capitol Police was just vile, and he didn't care.
I've asked the question of what is Trumpism to many of my guests on the podcast over the past year. Historians, Rich Lowry of the National Review, everybody had a little different take from the other, but all agreed that Trumpism is primarily about Trump. It's an open question as to whether this style of politics can survive without him. I tend to believe that we will continue to see this style of politics, but possibly without some of the ugly personality traits and other things you've been mentioning.
To me, I understood Republicans who felt they had to vote for him when the choice was Biden or him. I didn't make that choice, but I understand it. But after January 6th and after he lost, that was the time to just turn the page. And for people who didn't, that sort of is a breaking point for me, and why I think the January 6th Commission is so important and why we have to get all the facts on the table.
I want to get to the January 6th Commission, but one idea out there is that Trumpism is a narrative. It's a narrative of a stolen election. It's a way of approaching the world where you create your own reality and your followers may not stray from the one and only Trump-approved version of reality. And it remains to be seen if that narrative will endure. It's certainly not a good sign that there isn't more bipartisan support around investigating January 6th.
Well, I look at McCarthyism, right, as a previous iteration of this kind of ugliness, right? And you had Senator from Maine. I'm drawing a blank now. I can't believe I can't remember her name.
That's all right.
Margaret Chase Smith. When she went out and spoke against Joe McCarthy in 1950, and she was anti-communist. So like me, she was conservative. She was concerned about this. But when she asked him, what do you have for facts? Can I see it? She realized he was making things up. So she went on the Senate floor and gave her statement of conscience. I can't remember the official title of it, but she only had 6 senators who signed on with her for that statement. Unfortunately, we don't have C-SPAN then, so you can't see it. But she took all kinds of grief. But Margaret Chase Smith is, sort of a hero in history. 4 years later, 67 members of the Senate voted to censure McCarthy, and he was disgraced.
That's it. He was done, and then he died shortly after that.
Yeah, and that took 4 years. So I am not being Pollyanna-ish. I realize, you have people like Liz and Adam who are throwing themselves into the fire for this fight. That's why I stand with them, because I know how hard that is, and I know it's so much easier to do the other. But having worked with the people I've worked with over the years, and just from, you're not paid enough for these jobs to sell your soul. And then when you do, you find out it's not worth very much. I think you see George P. Bush having done the whole Trumpy thing, then he gets dissed and Trump endorses the horrible Ken Paxton. And I think those people who are selling their souls are going to find out,
Still, the House Minority Leader doesn't support the January 6th committee.
But it's going forward, fortunately, and it's actually going to be better because you don't have the ridiculous antics of a Jim Jordan or Matt Gaetz or whoever who would have been there just trying to divert from it. Yeah. You have serious people. And what you're going to hear in the January 6th committee that I think is going to be so important is you're going to hear the voices of Trump appointees, known conservatives like Bill Barr, like Jeff Rosen, who is the Deputy Attorney General, people in real time. I certainly hope they're going to hear from the White House counsel who is telling Donald Trump, you cannot do this. This is not legal. We don't want to have any part of this. And there are going to be notes about that, which he's obviously trying to suppress. Those people will have testimony to that effect. So that's why I think this is so important, because whether Trump cultists will face this or not, there are going to be people who Federalist Society people like and know, trusted figures like Bill Barr, who are going to have to say in real time, here's what I saw. Mark Meadows' notes from that day, one of the things apparently that Trump is trying to suppress. Mark Meadows may not tell you, but his notes will, and the people around him can tell you what he said that day. And was he saying one thing to Trump? Was he saying another thing to other people? Like, hey, we're trying to get him to calm down and back off. Because most of the people around him knew this was nonsense, according to the various books that have come out. And I think when you get those records, that's why in history, and as an investigator, when you get to really see actual records and notes and written accounts of things in real time, that tells you what you need to know about what happened. And you can put together those timelines. So it's not what people are saying on TV. It's in real time. Imagine all the texts that you could get from that day. There were more than a few members of Congress who were texting people at the White House or Ivanka or Jared.
Begging to have the president make a statement.
Yes. And why were they asking him to do that? Because they knew he was the only person who could turn off these monsters.
He was watching it on television, apparently enjoying it.
Celebrating it. So, I texted with people who said, you have to vote to certify now. You can't not vote to certify now.
Many Republicans still voted against certifying.
Yeah, so, it was horrible. But, even people forget, even Lindsey Graham at that point said, hey, I'm out. I can't do this. And he pointed out, he said, I asked people, you kept saying there were all these illegal votes. I asked, give me the names.
Of course,
give me 100 of them. Give me 10. Give me 1. They gave me nothing.
It was all a lie from the beginning. Donald Trump has declared every election that he's been a part of rigged. And the first one he did was the Iowa caucus when Ted Cruz won. He said that was a rigged election.
That's how he is in life. If he doesn't win, he just makes it up. And that's why he's so absurd and ridiculous. And I think he went on the radio on an obscure radio show yesterday that somebody sent me, or the day after the election, saying, I really won Virginia. And I'm more popular than Glenn Youngkin.
Oh, boy.
He lost by 10 points. And he's just, but he just figures if I say these things, I make them true. And he doesn't. It looks more and more pathetic. And I think the fact that he's not on Twitter, that he's not on the ballot, and that he's not in office makes him a diminished figure every day. Like last night, there was one of his PACs was down in Florida, I guess maybe at Mar-a-Lago, I'm not sure where, but you had Lauren Boebert wearing a dress. I guess it was a knockoff of AOC's dress. Instead of saying tax the rich down her butt, it said, let's go Brandon. So crude and so
it's like
ridiculous
antics.
And childish.
Are they there to legislate or to get attention?
The kind of people, Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Greene, this is the bottom feeders who he now has around him. Now, mind you, all of them are going to tell him to run because these are the kind of people who would never have been close to power in a real serious presidency. So this is going to go on for a while. And largely, I think this whole he's going to run again is coming from the people around him who make money off of him. Yeah. This is a money-making machine. This is what Trump has always been. Create an illusion that you're successful when all he did was inherit money, essentially. Yes, he had a lot of bankruptcies. So
he was a very successful entertainer, not so much a real estate developer recently.
And now he's just going to keep making money. He didn't give any money to Glenn Youngkin. Glenn Youngkin, God bless him, didn't give any money to Donald Trump last year. Glenn Youngkin gave money to help the Senate races, people like Susan Collins and Joni Ernst and the Georgia races that Trump killed. But, that's where his head was at. But Trump's all focused on himself and the money will go to him and his grifters around him. And I think that's the real story to see is how this is really a financial operation.
Well, Barbara, I don't know why the Republican Party would want, and I don't think privately they want him to run again. When I say the Republican Party, I'm talking about the leaders of the party.
No, if Trump disappeared tomorrow, there would be very few elected people, even the ones who say, except maybe those ones who go down and hang out at Mar-a-Lago, but there'd be very few electeds in the search party. They all privately just wish he would go away, but he makes their life miserable. So it's better to ignore him. And now I think there's a path to both ignore him and make him less relevant and put the focus on the issues, first of all, and the people, and make it about the future, because elections are always about the future. That's what Glenn understood. Who was focusing on the past? Terry McAuliffe, Trump.
McAuliffe's campaign was stale. January 6th, what do you call it? Was it a riot, an insurrection? CNN, a network you appear on, calls it a coup. They have a special report, an hour-long special that calls it an American coup. How do you refer to it?
I'd say all of the above. As far as a coup, I think the more we find out, it was an incompetent coup. Fortunately, a lot of these people around Trump are not very good at all. Yes, they obviously could enrage rioters, so they figured out something to do. But
there was no way to overturn the election that day. But
right. No, and they aren't a talented bunch. They aren't a smart bunch. And the real lawyers left the building and wouldn't have anything to do with this nonsense. It was Rudy and all the clowns is what Bill Barr called them. So there aren't serious people around him. The whole idea that Steve Bannon was some evil genius. Steve Bannon being the face of anything is a sure bet to get suburban women to recoil. If you saw him walking down your street, you'd run inside. That's not somebody you want to see. It's just instant revulsion.
Some Republicans or even some conservative intellectuals like George Will have left the Republican Party. Other Republican office holders or former office holders have gone so far as to say, vote for Democrats. But you're obviously not telling people to vote for Democrats. You're arguing that there is a future here with principled, as you put it, principled Republicans like Glenn Youngkin to expunge Trumpism from the party and continue to elect candidates who support lower taxes, deregulation, pro-life, go down the list of policies.
Well, I've always supported a variety of candidates. I worked very hard last year to get Susan Collins reelected. Trump attacked her all the time. And then Bill Kristol and his group jumped in and attacked her. I said, for God's sake, if we want to have normal Republicans in there, and Susan and I don't agree on everything, but what I agree on is her seriousness, her skills as a legislator, somebody who brings a lot to the table.
Instead of supporting her Democratic opponent, in other words.
Yes. So I do think it's a better Senate because she is there, that Lisa Murkowski's there, who I'm now helping now. So what I do is I selectively pick who I'm supporting. And that's what I often tell people, regardless of where you are in your party, support candidates that you think reflect the principles that you care about. I mean, when I ran, I had Democrats and independents support me who weren't part of the party, but cared about what I was doing or had issues I was working on that they could come together on. And I think, politics is about addition and bringing people together. And what Trump did was all division, dividing the country, but then dividing our party. And for people who despair, like how awful he is, I have so much faith in our system. And that's why I love now teaching college kids. And what I encourage them is be engaged, be involved, make sure you register to vote, because what Trump did is he turned out more people to vote against him and get him out. I mean, I was part of that 18 wave, but it was people saying, we want to send a message to him. I don't despair. I mean, I do look and see what he did, the insurrection, the riots, trying to have a coup, but because they were so untalented, they never, and I think there were enough backstops there, but our system worked. And I think it always works because we have checks and balances, good people. If good people are engaged and involved, which they should be, and they still are, like God bless Brad Raffensperger and Gabe Sterling in Georgia, Doug Ducey in Arizona, I think those people will be rewarded. And I think it's a great lesson to young people. And it's inspiring. That kind of person was always inspiring to me as a young person. That's why I relate to them. I am confident that the guy who got 47% and has now burned down more of his own 47% will never be president again unless the Democrats are totally, I guess they could be totally incompetent, but I don't think that'll happen.
I thought Donald Trump would have won re-election had it not been for the pandemic. Had he handled it better, of course, he might have won re-election too.
Well, no heart about it. It was all about him. Oh, it's so terrible that people are picking on me. It's like, people are dying. It's not always about you. He's the guy who goes to a funeral and talks about himself. It's just awful.
So we predict at our peril, Barbara Comstock, but I will ask you, where does the Republican Party go from here?
I think there's a great opportunity here for a new generation of leaders who will come forward and focus on issues and on their constituents, on the voters, and be that sunny, optimistic, future-oriented. I think post-pandemic, there's opportunities for all kinds of different approaches to issues on education, on immigration, how we're going to work, where we're going to work. And I think leaders like Mayor Suarez in Miami, I think is just very exciting. Our business leaders, where I'm working now, I get to work in the whole business community. I'm excited about the potential. So I'm still like the idealistic college kid I was. That's what I tell my students when I talk to them and encourage them, regardless of what party you're in, get out there and vote. And I should point out in Virginia, there's a real knife in the whole Stop the Steal conspiracy, because with a Democrat-run state, we won a close election. So for those who think, the election was stolen, how do you make that case when this has just happened? So this will stop the Steal conspiracy theorists, because we had close to have an election that close in New Jersey and in Virginia. And we had more people involved, and we had more historic voting, just like we did in 20. So the one thing Donald Trump has done is gotten everybody out. And
Republicans won House seats. They gained House seats in 2020 on the same ballots.
2020, which people down ballot, like a young Kim, Korean American from California, she won in a district that Trump lost. Those are our future leaders, people who ran on their own brand, ran talking to their communities. So I'm excited about the future with people like that. And yes, we've always had to deal with the Joe McCarthys, the Marjorie Greens, the misfits in politics, because it attracts them, because these people who just want to be celebrities, they want to be like Kardashians. They don't really want to do anything.
Yeah.
They're on TV all the time because this is the only way they could get on TV.
Well, as you say, the Trump base is small as a percentage of the entire electorate. And I always thought in politics, the idea was to appeal to as many voters as possible. But I think what we've seen is a vicious cycle, a vicious circle. I always get those two things confused, where the base becomes more and more influential or vocal, and it kind of reinforces itself. So because of the way House districts have been gerrymandered, and because of the threat of being primaried in any race, House or Senate, this small base has been dictating what the party can and cannot do. Minority rule.
Yeah, but that's why I like to support candidates who will, maybe appeal to the better angel of our natures, which Trump has obviously appealed to the darkness. A lot of the people, even who respond to Trump, like he's not really solving their problems. So he's just giving them this resentment and grievance thing. Whereas we need to have people who say, okay, we're going to figure out what is the next generation going to do with jobs if your jobs are going away. And so having somebody who knows how to do that and move you into workforce improvement, and upskilling and all of that is a big bipartisan area that we'll see post-pandemic activity, because we all have to have lifelong learning skills or we're going to be left behind. So there's all kinds of opportunities here that I think just a few people who work really hard and do the right thing can overcome kind of the lazy losers, who are ugly and nasty about things, because at the end of the day, people want to be uplifted. They don't want to have this grievance stuff and this ugliness.
Barbara Comstock, we thank you for sharing your thoughts on the future of your party. On the next episode of History as It Happens, are we heading toward herd immunity?
We could tell everyone that the vaccine was tested, it works, is safe and effective.
Historian John Barry returns to discuss when post-pandemic life will arrive and what it will look like. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.